Can you see? Okay. So here we go. Then, following the Argentine-Mexican philosopher Enrique Dussels' idea that, I quote, philosophy does not think philosophy thinks the non-philosophical, the reality, the historical reality, because it is a reflection on the philosopher's own reality. It starts from what already is, from his own world, from his system, from his speciality. Then I chose the lives of the Mexican Ignacio Ramírez, who lived in the 19th century, and the Roman Stoic Cato of Utica, or Cato the Younger, as exemplification of the possibility of an appropriate behavior on a personal level during an armed conflict, regardless of the political and ideological inclinations that anyone could have. So, reconsidering the idea of Marcus Tullius Cicero, that history is the source of proof and corroboration of different philosophical arguments, and this idea is shared by another thinkers, I argue that patriotism and adherence to a particular philosophy are two strong incentives for correct moral behavior, factors that could be stronger than even religion to practice a virtuous life. I developed this argument with a comparative study of the lives of these two characters, and well, at least this I tried to argue in the lives of Ramirez and Cato. Furthermore, as the philosopher Leopoldo Sea states, I quote, "Every philosophy has its torsion, its truth, and its historical conciliation." End of quote. I think Mexican liberalism, rationalism, and skepticism found its historical conciliation in Ramirez, as well the Roman Stoicism found its historical conciliation in Cato of Utica, as well as in Seneca or the philosopher Marcus Aurelius. So in the book De Oratore, Cicero establishes that the optimal speaker, orator, is a good guide, a moral guide for the human being, because through his speeches, he can assert that good actions are chosen in government. Agreeing with Cicero, the best speaker should always have knowledge of history and will make proper use of this knowledge. Thus, history could also be a guide for the human being, primarily in the art of government or in the achievement of real virtue. For Cicero, the virtue is a habit of mind. And I quote, "It has four parts: prudence, justice, strength, and temperance." This comes in the book De Inventione. And he describes the virtue of prudence as a science, scientia, the virtue of justice as a habit, and the virtue of strength as an acceptance and a suffering, and the virtue of temperance as a dominatium. So the virtues are thus conceived as human acts, always applicable and applied to practical and political reality, and not to mere speculation. And this is, I propose, the same conception that, as we will see, held by Ramirez and Cato. So I first start with some bio lines of Ignacio Ramírez. Ramirez was born in 1818 in San Miguel Allende, the state of Guanajuato. In 1834, his family moved to Mexico City, where he studied arts at the Colegio de San Gregorio, where he also had a formation in philosophy, theology, history, and other disciplines. And he became fond of the ideas of the French encyclopedist. In his speech to access the Academy of Lettres, which was an academy ecclesiastical, the adolescent declares himself an atheist and denies the existence of God, basing his ideas in the Latin Epicurean philosopher Titus Lucretius. In 1845, he began his journalistic career with the pseudonym El Nigromante, that means the necromancer, Nigromante. And some years later, he, inside the liberal newspaper Temis and Deucalion, publishes a very belligerent article entitled A los Indios, to the Indians, an analysis of the indigenous situation with a drastic moral. If they want to get out of their prostration, the indigenous only have armed rebellion as an alternative, then proposing some kind of violent resistance against the Mexican government. Ramirez is imprisoned for this article. Years later, in 1856, he served as a deputy in the Provisional Congress, and in his congressional speeches, he attacks the persistence of religious language in Mexican politics, legislation, constitution, etc. For the Nigromancer, it is ridiculous to consider some patriots as interpreters of the divinity. For him, divine right is written by the hand of the oppressors and is the pretext for slavery and ignorance. So on the eve of the fierce Mexican Civil War in 1857, he wrote another article against President Ignacio Comonfort, whom he considered to have distances from liberalism. Such president sent him to jail, but Ramirez, held by some liberals, escapes and flees to Sinaloa, the state of Sinaloa, but on the way he's caught by the conservative General Tomás Mejía, and in prison he's intimidated and suffers various humiliations, including parading on the back of a donkey and while the soldiers stone him. The Civil War of Reform began in 1858, and it was at the end of such year that Ramirez was released from the Tlatelolco prison after the liberals won this war. Where he lived in this prison, the harshest of miseries. When the French troops occupied Puebla in 1863 in the context of the Second French Intervention, the Second Civil War that Ramirez had to experience, the Mexican government left Mexico City and many troops went northwest. Ignacio Ramírez retired with them. At the end of 1864, he went to the United States and began a journey of several months in which he visited San Francisco and the Gulf of California. And by 1865, he's traveling between the states of Sinaloa and Sonora, writing against the empire and in favor of the liberal government. In 1866, shortly before the execution of Maximilian of Habsburg, here in the picture, in the left, he was again imprisoned in San Juan de Lua and later in the state of Yucatan, where he will become a victim of yellow fever. He then goes back to Mexico City, where he will continue to live under police surveillance. By 1866, he is appointed Minister of Justice and Public Instruction, and in his 2 years in office, he tries to reform the judicial and educational system, and he died in 1879, obtaining recognition from his enemies and his friends for his ability and his probity. Ramirez was a pragmatic man who was not inclined to speculations, but to give practical examples and advocate empirical and useful research for society. He directly attacked the study of metaphysics by asserting that, I quote, the abstract and hypothetical